Hello and welcome to Class 4. Today we will be talking about how to do critical thinking from a psychological standpoint. This means that we're going to expand the scope of what we are looking at to include not just what people say they believe, but also their unconscious mental processes. Interestingly, some of these unconscious mental processes will continue to look like inferences, which we saw in arguments in the previous class. So the basic language of argument and inference that we studied in the last class in some ways still applies. The study of cognitive bias cognitive bias is the focus for the psychological approach to critical thinking. It begins in the 1970s with two Israeli psychologists, Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman. They were close friends. They worked together. They had a knack for developing experiments that would expose the way that people are systematically irrational. So it's not just that people are irrational, but their irrationality follows patterns. So here's a simple example. They would ask subjects to follow math problems, but not give them enough time to do it right. So they're no longer studying how people do math properly. They're studying how people do math improperly, irrationally. And what they found from these experiments was that there were actually patterns in the way people make mistakes that they thought revealed something about the underlying structure of the brain, or at least structure of cognitive processes. So with the math experiments, what they found is people who are given a math problem with big numbers loaded early, like the one on top, estimate that the final answer is going to be much larger than people who are given the math problem on the bottom, where the small numbers are loaded early. So this came to be known as the anchoring effect. This is the tendency that information you have, this is the tendency of information that you receive first to have a distorting effect on the rest of your thinking. This is actually a technique that Calvin knows well. Calvin from Calvin and Hobbes, if you're a fan of classic cartoon strips. So Calvin asks, "Mom, can I set fire to my bed mattress?" "No, Calvin." "Can I ride my tricycle off the roof?" "No, Calvin." "Then can I have a cookie?" "No, Calvin." And Calvin thinks, she's on to me. So, right, the joke here is that he is trying to use the anchoring effect in order to trick his mother, right? Information people get early distort their subsequent thinking. So in this case, setting fire to your bed mattress makes having a cookie seem reasonable. And this is similar to, at least Kahneman and Tversky thought that this was basically the same thing that was going on with the math problems. You set up a psychological anchor in people's minds, right? The big numbers early in the problem set up an anchor. The idea of your 5-year-old setting fire to his bed mattress sets up an anchor, and that is supposed to distort later thinking. And in the case of the math problems, it did, but in the case of Calvin's mom, she's on to him. Okay, so we can define the anchoring effect this way. The anchoring effect is a cognitive bias that occurs when the first piece of information received affects judgments about subsequent information. And this is a phenomenon that doesn't just appear in solving math problems or asking your mother for a cookie. It appears in contract negotiations, job interviews, going on a first date, pricing. When the waiter comes out and you ask what wine they have, they show you an expensive wine first, so that the second most expensive wine looks reasonable. In some ways, the lesson here is that not only do you never get a second chance to make a first impression, but you are constantly making and receiving first impressions. So when people offer this advice, they say, pay attention to how you make your first impression. But also remember that people's first impression on you can be deceiving, and often intentionally so. And this comes up everywhere. Tversky and Kahneman's initial theory was that the effects they were seeing were the products of heuristics. There's the word, right? Heuristics, which are shortcuts that the brain is taking. This is what the textbook we'll be using has to say for the cognitive bias section about heuristics. We often rely on rough and ready strategies called heuristics in our reasoning. In many cases, these heuristics allow us to draw reliable inferences quickly. But if we rely on them too heavily or in the wrong situations, they can lead to bad reasoning. Part of the idea here is that even though heuristics lead to false beliefs and irrational behavior, there is nothing intrinsically wrong with them in themselves. In fact, the book we'll be using emphasizes that finding and using good heuristics is a part of critical thinking. And in the end, we can't avoid using heuristics anyway because we have finite brains and finite time. Eventually, we have to take a shortcut. But every heuristic is going to have some drawbacks. There are going to be some contexts where the heuristic leads you astray. And there are going to be people out there, some of them not as cute from Calvin and Hobbes, who will try to exploit them. Thinking about heuristics can help us identify patterns in the mistakes we make so that we can avoid them. The idea of cognitive bias has evolved over time since Kahneman and Tversky's initial ideas about heuristics. Nowadays, any systematic distortion in thinking gets labeled a cognitive bias, even if it doesn't really make sense to think of it as a cognitive shortcut. So we can say in general that a cognitive bias is a widespread distortion in the way people think. Often this is not a matter of explicit belief. As I've emphasized, we are now approaching critical thinking through the lens of psychology rather than philosophy. So we're not just thinking about beliefs that people might say out loud. They might be things like unconscious patterns of attention. One important cognitive bias that we all have is we tend to simply not notice things that don't fit our prior beliefs. This bias isn't a belief, it's a kind of inattention, and we'll be talking about that a little bit later in this video. Although the idea of cognitive bias has expanded to include things that aren't heuristics, it's generally assumed that these patterns of reasoning exist for a reason. The fact that they are good heuristics is one reason, but it might not be the only one. It may just have to do with the way our web of belief is structured. So I just said that we tend to not notice things that go against our beliefs. And this might be because we need to keep some beliefs protected at the core of our web of belief, and that means that we simply won't notice things. A lot of times people invoke human evolution here, saying that these cognitive biases exist because they were the most adaptive thing in the environment that we evolved in. It's worth remembering, though, that the only part of human evolution that people really agree on is that it happened in Africa, mostly. But as I said, the idea of cognitive bias has expanded beyond the initial idea of a heuristic or cognitive shortcut, so that any systematic distortion in people's thinking will will wind up being labeled a cognitive bias. Let me give you an example. The concept I'm going to be leading this section off with is something that I'm going to be labeling in-group epistemic distortion. This is a collection of effects that happen when a group becomes epistemically isolated from a larger whole, leading to systematic ignorance. This work has been studied by a variety of scholars, including Nguyen on echo chambers, De Cruz on believing to belong, and Festinger on cognitive dissonance. I wanted to highlight that because I think it demonstrates a lot of the problems that we're looking at right now. But in any case, that's not my way in. My way in is testimonial injustice. So, testimonial injustice is a kind of injustice where one is wronged because one's assertions are not given the right amount of credibility. So, assertions, statements, you say things. People believe them or they don't. When you're asserting something, you're kind of putting something out there as it's a bit of a social chance. You're saying, I think this is true. And some people will immediately accept it. Some people will doubt it. And if they don't do that properly, it's kind of an insult. So testimonial injustice creates barriers across the flow of barriers to the flow of information across networks. Because some people are given too much credibility and some people are denied credibility. And a lot of this relates to people who are... So this book was written after Tversky passed away. In this book, Kahneman says that the brain is made of two kinds of systems. One kind operates slowly and one kind operates quickly. Hence the title of the book, Thinking Fast and Slow. So now I'm going to cut over to an earlier video where I explain about these two kinds of systems and then run through the cognitive biases that Clear discusses. Some of what I say may be redundant with what I said in this more recently recorded video, but that's okay because repetition helps learning. And he calls them System 1 and System 2. It might be better to talk about Type 1 process and Type 2 process because they don't form unified systems. The Type 1 processes are actually, in some ways, this is the kinds of things that we would associate with emotional thinking. But we're gonna sharpen this into a better, a more scientifically tractable idea. So a System 1 process is anything that goes on in your brain that operates rapidly, unconsciously, in the background, automatic, and involuntary. The way your perception is shaped by all sorts of habits is a System 1 process. So if you hear a noise, your eyes will dart over to the source of the noise, right? That habit of moving your attention is a System 1 process. System 1 processes have a lot of things that are evolved. That is, we, by evolution, will look towards a sound to see what's going on. The System 1 processes can also be learned. If, for instance, you've been in an environment where a certain sound is associated with a threat, say military combat, right? You'll have a System 1 reaction to, say, the sound of something that sounds like gunfire. The process of driving a car for most people is entirely a system, in America, is entirely System 1, right? I bet you've done a thing where you've just kind of spaced out while driving the car and not just sort of automatically driven, say, to work, right? It's because there's a lot of unconscious processing going on with System 1. System 2 is anything that you do with your mind that is slower, conscious, and it requires deliberate effort, right? It's voluntary. If I decide to focus my attention on a certain place, if I decide, for instance, if I want to meditate and I'm staring at a candle, I focus my attention on the candle. That's the System 2 process. System 2 processes are like critical thinking. They require effort. So basically, cognitive biases are products of System 1, and they can be mitigated using System 2, right? So a few more words about System 1 and System 2. I already mentioned that System 1 includes things that can be learned, right? So if you drive a car, for instance, you drive a car, you hear a siren, you slow down, right? You look around for the siren. It's a system, that is a learned System 1 process. Another thing about System 1 processes is that they continue even when you know they are present. It's actually hard to discipline yourself not to do a System 1 process, like look when you hear a noise. On the other hand, System 2, because it requires effort, it goes offline all the time. It requires an effort to keep it online, and if you're tired, you're less likely to use your System 2 kinds of reasoning processes. So I define cognitive bias as a systematic distortion in people's reasoning. An obvious way of understanding cognitive bias, then, is that they have their origin in System 1 processes, since those processes are always operating in the background. And this way of thinking about them fits well with Tversky and Kahneman's original idea that they were all based in heuristics and the basic functioning of the brain. So if cognitive biases are System 1 processes, the solution is to use System 2 processes to counteract them whenever you can. Okay, so this gives us two ways to think about mistakes in reasoning. One way to think about them is the old fallacy way, and that's to think of reasoning as something represented in arguments that can be written in standard form. Mistakes are bad inferences, bad ways of moving from one belief to another, and this is the traditional philosophical approach. The other way to think about mistakes in reasoning is to think about them as cognitive biases. On this conception, mistakes in reasoning are ingrained mental habits. Mistakes in reasoning do not necessarily involve conscious belief. Mistakes in reasoning do not necessarily involve moving from one belief to another. This is the modern psychological approach. I should emphasize that this body of psychological research is relatively new and evolving, and recently subject to a fair amount of challenge. And that's because science is supposed to be replicable. Scientists can't just say things. They have to be able to produce a phenomenon and then produce it again and again. Some of the processes that have been identified by people who research cognitive bias, including Kahneman and Tversky themselves, have failed to replicate. So in particular, there was a body of literature that I was relying on in this course for a while that claimed that making decisions makes you tired. That may seem obvious. It seems clear that just making up your mind requires mental effort. But the research said that making up your mind in one area led to a global fatigue that would transfer over into other areas. And that research just failed to replicate. So there's a lot of problems like that with this research. But all the stuff that we're going to be talking about here in this class is known and replicable. So I'm just going to talk about 5 cognitive biases. And these are listed in the article by James Clear. So the Kahneman is by a world famous psychologist. The James Clear article is just some guy who explains things on the internet, and I think does a pretty good job of it. And so he picked out 5 biases. There are a world of biases out there, and there are different ways of counting them and dividing them up and that sort of thing. But I think that these are a good 5 to know, just to be aware of your own, biases. And so, as I said previously, the mother of all cognitive bias is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the tendency to discount or ignore evidence that contradicts your current beliefs. We love to have our beliefs confirmed. Every time something happens and we knew it was the kind of thing that would happen, we love to say we knew it. Yeah. So we seek out things that confirm our beliefs, and we ignore things that don't. Often this is all just at the level of perception. But it also will happen at the level of more conscious argument, as when, for instance, we just dismiss out of hand things that are said by people that we disagree with or dislike. Okay, so that's the mother of them all, and that's the one that if you remember anything 10 years from now, remember confirmation bias. Loss aversion. So this is an interesting one. We are naturally very conservative in that we don't like to give up things that we have. If something is described as being a loss, we are more likely to be afraid of it than if it's described alternately. So Kahneman and Tversky have a number of experiments like this. So the one I've got on the slide here is actually just about how thinking something is yours makes you want it more. So there's a classic experiment where you start out by giving people either a free mug or free chocolate. And then you have the opportunity to either keep the mug or trade it for something else. And people generally choose to keep what they got first, even though that assignment was random, right? Alternately, another experiment, this is more famous from Kahneman and Tversky. Tversky was Kahneman's longtime research partner, and he passed away before Kahneman wrote the book that you were reading from. But they conducted most of their research together. They did a bunch of experiments where people were asked to choose between 2 alternatives. And for instance, they imagined that there's a disease that has arrived in your country, and you have a choice between 2 courses of treatment. And how people chose in this scenario depended on whether you described it as the number of lives lost or the number of lives saved. So people would get the same experiment, same scenario, but some of them would be told about the losses and some of them would be told about the lives saved, even though numerically those 2 work out to be the same thing, right? And people, what choice you made varied with whether you were thinking of things as a potential loss or a potential gain. survivorship bias. So this actually overlaps with a lot of other kinds of cognitive bias, but basically we have a tendency to only look at winners and ignore losers. And often the things that we need to pay attention to involve comparing winners and losers, right? So the example from Clear is about looking at billionaires, right? So Richard Branson, Bill Gates, and Mark Zuckerberg all dropped out of school. You're looking at winners, you see their school dropouts, you conclude that you don't need to go to school to succeed. Well, there are a lot of things wrong with this inference, but just for starters, if you want to look at how much school impacts economic success, you need to compare people who go to school with other people, with people who don't go to school, right? You can't just look at a few successful people and work backwards. You need to look forward from two groups, a group that has the potential cause, in this case going to school, and a group that doesn't, and then look at how the effects play out in those two groups. Another example of this, and I'm going to do a bunch with survivorship bias just because I happen to have some examples at hand. People in general assume that any process that they survive is fair, right? So you just look at the survivors of, say, graduate school, which is a rather harrowing experience that I don't recommend to anyone. People, when you just look at people who successfully graduated from a program in philosophy, and you think, oh, well, that must be fair. It produced all of these great people. But you don't, in order to understand the effect of a process, you need to look at both people who get through it and people who don't. Another example that's been a source of memes, that's been the source of a quite popular meme, if you are on the parts of the internet where people share memes about cognitive biases, is this image of an airplane from World War II. So the military was keeping track of airplanes that came in from combat and where they had bullet holes, right? And what they found was represented by this diagram here. The red spots are where there were a lot of bullet holes on planes that were returning from combat. So initially, the generals wanted to put additional reinforcement, additional metal, on those spots where those planes that were coming back had a lot of bullet holes. And then, but one other guy, a Hungarian-born Jewish mathematician named Abraham Wald, pointed out that you're just looking at the airplanes that come home from fighting. If you really want to look for the weak points, look at the area. You need to compare that with the areas where planes where the planes don't. Well, you need to compare the planes that come home with the planes that don't, right? And in fact, what you want to do is reinforce the areas where the planes that didn't make it got shot. So again, survivorship bias happens when you only look at the survivors of a process, when really you need to compare both sides. And a whole lot of cognitive bias actually just comes up from inferring a causal relationship in a situation where actually all you know is where two things are present, and you don't know about what happens when the cause is not present or the effect is not present, that sort of thing. It may actually be that the cognitive bias that the survivorship bias is just a part of a larger bias called availability heuristic. This is the form of cognitive bias that occurs when you just look at the evidence that's immediately available to you. That is, so it's availability heuristic. You look at what's around you. It's a heuristic, meaning that it's a general rule for our habit of reasoning. But often the evidence that's just immediately around you is misleading, right? So if you look at newspapers, you will be under the impression that there's a lot of crime, because newspapers just always report crime. It keeps people reading. Crime comes and crime goes, largely driven by factors like the number of unemployed young men. If you just look at the evidence that is immediately available to you, you'll get a misleading picture of things. All right, the last one I want to talk about is anchoring bias. And this one is a good one to keep in mind because people will deliberately use this on you all the time. And I think of this as, the standard example is the waiter bringing out a bottle of wine. The waiter you say, I'd like some wine. And the waiter says, well, we've got this $100 bottle of wine. And suddenly you're like, what? No, that's ridiculous. And then he says, well, what about this $50 bottle of wine? And suddenly $50, which may have been more than you wanted to spend on a single bottle of wine in an evening, becomes reasonable, right? So what happens is the first piece of information that you receive affects judgment becomes an anchor, and it affects judgment about all subsequent information, right? And so actually, if you have children, they may have picked up on this, right? I'm imagining my daughter, I guess I wrote this slide when she was maybe 12, but she's like, hey, can I have $100 to spend at Hot Topic? No. Okay, can I download an album for $10? Oh, okay. Well, actually, I didn't want to give her any money. She hadn't done any chores. But, the second alternative appears reasonable in light of the first. So all of these are habits of reasoning. They actually exist for a reason, typically, that they are evolved. They are products of system one, that is, our automatic responses. We will automatically think of a $10 expense as cheap when it's just been compared with a $100 expense. And it needs to be contradicted with system two, where you make a deliberate effort to say, wait a minute, let me think about this. Would I have said yes to this if I hadn't been primed this way? That sort of thing. Okay, for next time, we are going to be doing a reading by Maureen Linker from a book called Intellectual Empathy. This is our introduction to the idea of social epistemology. Social epistemology is the study of the way we work together in groups to create knowledge or fail to create knowledge. And intellectual empathy is going to be at the root of social epistemology, in that we can't work together on an intellectual project unless we understand each other intellectually. So that's where the Maureen Linker reading comes in. There's an exercise associated with this on diversity, fatigue, and intersectionality, because part of what Linker is going to be talking about is how different group identities can keep us from understanding each other and how we can overcome that. And then there's a video to go with that.